Small-town mechanic creates flood-proof vehicle. Next day, 7 limo visits his garage. They say miracles don't drive old trucks, but on the morning Elmwood became a lake, one did. At 7:12 a.m., while the town braced for disaster, a 1995 Ford pickup, paint peeling and tires half submerged, rolled straight through floodwaters thick enough to swallow sedans and silence engines. Nobody understood what they were seeing. Not at first. Water lapped across windshields, fire trucks stalled, cruisers floated like driftwood, and this truck, this rust-bitten machine, just kept moving. Not sputtering, not choking, just purring like it was cruising down dry asphalt on a spring morning. Deputy Jake Williams had seen wrecks, riots and rescue missions, but nothing prepared him for that moment. Mouth open, rain soaking his uniform, radio static hissing in his ear, he watched as the truck calmly passed his stalled patrol car. Water was up to the hood, the engine running like a song. Jake didn't know the driver's name right away. He just knew the man behind the wheel looked like he belonged to another era. Battered cap, jaw set in stone, eyes locked forward. The kind of man who didn't ask for help, didn't wait for orders, didn't blink in a storm. Just drove, and as the strange truck moved down the street, slicing through rising currents and abandoned vehicles, Jake whispered the only name that came to mind. Gibson. Walter Gibson, local mechanic, longtime widow. Kind of guy who ate breakfast at Marie's Diner every morning and never once looked surprised by bad news. Jake had pulled him over a dozen times over the years for busted taillights or expired tags. Never a word of protest, just a nod. But now, the guy who once fixed tractors and rewired lawnmowers was cutting through a flood that had shut down the entire county. Word traveled fast as water down Elmwood's hills. By the time Walter turned onto Market Street, heads were appearing in second-story windows, phones recording, people pointing, jaws dropping. He didn't wave, didn't slow down. The truck roared past storefronts with sandbags already giving way, past the church with stained glass windows glowing faintly through the storm, past cars up to their mirrors in brown, debris-choked runoff. In his rear view he saw nothing but chaos, sirens swallowed by thunder, lights blinking on lifeless vehicles, the town drowning in its own quiet panic. That truck, they would later say, looked like it belonged in a sci-fi film, raised intake pipes like snorkels, strange black tubing snaked across its hood, exhaust vents sealed tighter than a submarine's hatch. Nothing about it made sense, but it moved, smooth, confident, unstoppable, and in a town where everything was breaking, levees, engines, phone lines, even hope, Walter Gibson's machine held steady. It defied logic, defied weather, defied failure. 17 people would be alive by sundown because of that vehicle. Strangers, neighbors, children, elders. Some were pulled from sinking cars, others from rooftops. But right now, none of that was known. Right now, the only thing clear was the image seared into the minds of everyone watching. A man with a forgotten name steering a flood-proof truck down a road that wasn't supposed to exist anymore. Jake watched him go until the taillights disappeared behind a curtain of rain. He didn't reach for his radio, didn't call for backup. All he did was take one shaky breath and mutter, half to himself and half to whatever force had built that miracle of steel and stubbornness, "What in God's name did you build, Walter?" And Elmwood's flood story, the one that would be told in newsrooms and boardrooms and war rooms around the world, had just begun. 3 days before the flood turned Elmwood into a headline, Walter Gibson stood in the back of his garage hunched over the exposed guts of a 1995 Ford F-150, like a surgeon mid-operation. The morning light barely cut through the grime-smudged windows, catching the swirl of dust and metal shavings that floated lazily in the air. The truck looked like something from another world. Instead of a clean hood, a mess of pipes twisted across it like a steel octopus. Where most mechanics would have seen a junker on its last leg, Walter saw a possibility, a challenge worth solving, one bolt and gasket at a time. He'd spent the better part of 6 months re-engineering every major system of the vehicle. The air intake, raised, sealed, filtered. The exhaust, rerouted and baffled to function even underwater. Electrical systems, waterproofed and isolated, protected with the kind of care usually reserved for submarines, not pickups. He hadn't just modified the truck, he'd transformed it, and nobody had the faintest idea why. Ray Martinez did, at least he thought he did. Walter's oldest friend and his only full-time employee, Ray had been there through all the head-scratching and head-shaking. He emerged from under a Civic now, grease on his hands and disbelief in his voice. "Still working on that contraption?" he asked, walking toward the Frankenstein Ford with a rag slung over his shoulder. "Looks like it's growing tentacles." Walter didn't look up. "Just calibrating the auxiliary pump system. Almost done." Ray snorted. "You've been almost done since April." He leaned closer, eyeing the maze of components that had taken over what used to be a recognizable engine bay. "Nobody's gonna buy a truck that looks like it came out of a horror movie." Walter finally straightened up, wiped his forehead with the sleeve of his flannel, and said with that steady calm of his, "Not trying to sell it." He said it like that ended the conversation. Across the garage, Bobby Turner rolled out from under a sedan, his coveralls stained and his face streaked with oil. He was 18, sharp-eyed and sharp-witted, and completely baffled by his mentor's obsession. "Work for what, Mr. Gibson?" he asked, pushing himself to his feet and wiping his hands on a rag. "I mean, I've watched you build this thing, but I still don't get what it's supposed to do." Walter studied him for a second. Bobby was green, but he had that hunger in his eyes. Hunger for answers, for mastery, for meaning. "You remember the flood of 09? Walter asked, his voice turning grave. Bobby shook his head. "Before my time, sir." 4 people died, Walter said flatly. Water rose so fast their cars stalled out on the Washington Bridge. Couldn't get out in time. One of them was a girl, just back from college, Mrs. Henderson's daughter. The garage fell quiet. Even the hum of a nearby radio seemed to fade. Ray stopped wiping his hands and looked away. Everyone in Elmwood remembered that year. They remembered the names, the faces, the funerals, and they remembered the silence that followed, how fast the town forgot, how little had changed. Walter's voice cut through the stillness again. "And again in 2015, 2 more lost. Last year it was just homes. Nobody died. Lucky, but luck doesn't last forever." That was why he worked late nights with no one watching. Why he spent his own savings ordering parts online, scavenging scrapyards, drilling holes into perfectly good metal. Because Walter didn't trust luck, he trusted preparation. Ray crossed his arms. "Weather service says we're headed for drought. No real rain in weeks." Walter didn't even blink. Patterns change. And with that he turned back to the truck like the conversation was over. But Bobby wasn't done. He lingered, glancing at the vehicle's high-mounted snorkel, the thick rubber seals on the doors, the strange pump mounted just behind the cab. "So it's not a boat," he said slowly. "Not really a truck anymore either. What is it?" Walter answered without looking up. "It's a machine that runs when others don't. It works when it matters, when the water comes." He didn't say if, he said when, and that made something in Bobby go quiet. Not scared exactly, just aware. This wasn't some eccentric's pet project. It was a warning, a solution to a problem most folks hadn't even admitted existed. Outside, the sun climbed higher, illuminating a town blissfully unaware of the storm brewing beyond the edge of the forecast. Inside that garage, Walter Gibson kept working, torque wrench in one hand, memory in the other, building the one thing nobody knew they would soon depend on. Not for show, not for sale. Just because someone had to. To most people in Elmwood, Walter Gibson's truck looked like something between a scrapyard Frankenstein and a midlife crisis. Its roof was rigged with strange black tubes. Its hood bristled with vents and clamps and protrusions that didn't belong. Sealed gaskets surrounded the doors. The undercarriage was layered in some kind of epoxy blend, and there were odd protrusions around the wheel wells that looked like repurposed scuba gear. It had no badge, no make, no model, no pride. It didn't purr, it growled, and people laughed. They laughed when they saw it sputtering down Main Street with Walter behind the wheel, jaw set, eyes forward like a man driving towards something no one else could see. They rolled their eyes when he turned down Friday fish fry invitations to finish adjustments, on something they assumed wouldn't work outside of a science fair. They whispered behind coffee mugs at Marie's diner that he was slipping since Margaret passed, that maybe he just needed something to tinker with, some grief project to keep his hands busy. But none of them asked him what he was really building, and Walter never offered. He wasn't designing for the present, not for blue skies and dry roads and polite nods from neighbors who thought preparedness meant a few sandbags in the shed. He was designing for the hour when the creek turned to river and the streets turned to trap. Every time he torqued a bolt on the intake tubing, he heard water slamming against windshield glass. Every time he sealed an electrical component, he saw headlights winking out under floodwaters. Every time he tested the weight distribution, he thought of the minivans and sedans and pickup trucks he'd seen washed downstream like toys. It wasn't paranoia, it was memory, cold, bitter memory. The intake system had been the first problem he solved. Airflow was the engine's lifeline, and water was its assassin. He built a snorkel system that could draw clean air, even if the hood was fully submerged. Not just a pipe, it had baffles, filters, pressure sensors, redundant seals that could withstand bursts and backflow. It extended above the cab, where it couldn't be choked by even the highest street-level floods. But that wasn't enough. Walter knew floods weren't clean. They carried oil, mud, chemicals, things that corroded and contaminated, so he added a secondary filtration unit beneath the dashboard, routing air through a two-stage system he designed from scratch. Most of the parts came from agricultural equipment, tractors, harvesters, machines that had to keep working in wet, dirty, unforgiving conditions. Not glamorous, but tough. Next came the exhaust. People forget how many engines fail in water, not because they can't breathe, but because their exhaust system chokes. Water pushes back through the pipes into the engine block, drowns the combustion before it can even start. Walter rebuilt the entire thing with a series of one-way valves and high-mounted exit points. The exhaust exited from the side of the truck, not below it. Shorter route, less exposure, more control. He tested it in his own farm pond for months, starting the truck submerged just past the tires, then pushing deeper, bit by bit, modification by modification. He logged each run in a notebook, scrawling notes in tiny print, refining tolerances by hand because no manual existed for what he was trying to do. And when something failed, and many things did, he fixed it, welded it, sealed it better than before, then ran the test again. The electrical system was perhaps the trickiest. Water doesn't just ruin wires. It whispers into junction boxes, climbs into connectors, shorts out circuits like poison in the bloodstream. So Walter rewired every essential system with military-grade connectors, the kind used in battlefield communications. He coated relays in silicon sealant, mounted fuse boxes in elevated, sealed compartments, and wrapped the entire ignition system in waterproof housing that had once belonged to a marine generator. The dash, rebuilt from scratch. He added gauges, intake pressure, exhaust flow, water intrusion levels, a humidity sensor under the hood, a kill switch behind the glove compartment in case everything else failed. And all of it was simple, not sleek, not polished, just functional, accessible, fixable, something any decent mechanic could learn to understand. The weight distribution became the final hurdle. Most vehicles float long before they're truly underwater. The moment the tires lose contact with the ground, control vanishes. Walter added ballast. Heavy metal weights secured low along the chassis. Not enough to ruin fuel economy. He'd already swapped the engine for a low RPM diesel that sipped rather than guzzled, but enough to keep the wheels grounded through 3 feet of water. The suspension was replaced with a reinforced leaf system. Heavy duty, built to take a beating. The tires were custom, deep tread, run flat with extra sidewall strength, designed not just for grip, but for survival. And through all of it, he said almost nothing. People watched from their porches as he drove test runs in silence, windows down, measuring wind noise, torque, and control. They called it eccentric. They called it crazy. Some called it dangerous. Evelyn Holloway from the town council even suggested that Walter should keep his experiments out of public view before he scared the tourists. Walter didn't argue. He didn't explain. He just nodded, turned back into his garage and kept working. He wasn't building it for approval. He was building it for the moment when approval wouldn't matter, when silence would settle over the town like a curtain, when the river would rise with no warning and people would realize, too late, that cell towers don't float and power grids don't swim. When engines would die mid-sentence and headlights would vanish under black water, and the only thing that could cut through would be something built not for comfort, not for looks, but for one singular stubborn goal: to keep going. 3 days before the flood, Walter Gibson had already lived that moment 100 times in his mind. That's why his hands didn't shake when he tested the backup power inverter for the 4th time. Why his voice didn't raise when Ray told him he was wasting his life. Why he kept welding when others went home for dinner. Because he wasn't building for the now. He was building for the storm no one else believed was coming. And in just 72 hours it would come, harder, faster, and far more devastating than anyone had dared to imagine. But Walter wouldn't be surprised. He'd be ready. The sky changed at 3:46 p.m. It didn't roll in slow and ominous like storms sometimes do, giving you that long, low warning, that chance to squint at the horizon and wonder if you ought to move the car or cover the grill. No, this one snapped, like a switch being thrown. One moment the sun was burning holes in the cracked sidewalks of Elmwood, kids riding bikes through sprinklers, dogs panting under porch fans, and the next, everything stopped. The wind shifted, not just a breeze, but a wall of air that moved in like it had purpose. It came cold, smelling like metal and dirt, the kind of scent that doesn't belong to rain, but to rupture. Trees that had stood still all summer bent suddenly in one direction, flags snapped flat, and every bird in the county vanished at once, as if some unseen force had pulled them straight out of the sky. Then the clouds arrived, thick, dark, heavy as wet wool, not grey, not charcoal, green, that unnatural stomach-turning green that makes people pause in the middle of whatever they're doing and stare upward because their bodies sense something ancient and wrong before their minds can name it. Within 5 minutes, thunder cracked like cannon fire, and the first sheets of rain slammed down hard enough to shake roof tiles loose. Walter Gibson didn't look at the sky. He'd already seen it coming, felt it in the pressure drop, read it in the barometer he kept mounted above the tool bench like a sacred relic. At 3:43, he closed the truck's hood for the final time, checked the seal on the battery casing, and stood still for 3 full seconds, listening, not to the weather, but to the engine. It was idling, strong, stable, all systems green, every modification intact, every seal holding. He walked inside the house, washed the grease from his arms in the mudroom sink, and changed into his boots, rain gear, and the old canvas jacket Margaret had once patched at the elbow. On the way out the door, he grabbed 2 duffel bags, one with emergency supplies, the other with a foldable water stretcher and climbing rope. Then he walked back into the garage, opened the driver's side door, and slid behind the wheel like a man settling into routine, not racing into crisis. Across town, people were still deciding whether to take the storm seriously. Some had seen the forecast, possible showers, slight chance of flooding in low areas, and gone about their day. Others were already racing to hardware stores for sandbags and backup batteries. Cell phones buzzed with contradictory updates. Traffic backed up along Route 12 as folks tried to beat the weather home. And over at the fire station, the chief stood in soaked turnout gear trying to convince the county dispatcher that this wasn't just another spring storm. The rain didn't fall. It pounded, a solid sheet of water that blurred everything more than 30 feet away. Drains clogged almost immediately, overflowing into yards and driveways within minutes. By 4:10, the creek that wound along the edge of town had spilled its banks, devouring the first row of houses like a mouth opening wide. Walter eased the truck onto the street, windshield wipers struggling to keep up, tires slicing through water that had already covered the lower part of the curb. He reached down, flipped on the auxiliary systems, intake pump, internal power management, cabin seal pressurization. All lights green, no stalls, no sputter. He tapped the radio mounted to the dash. the one he'd custom-tuned to run on both local emergency channels and his own encrypted frequency. A test line chirped back. Clear. He spoke 2 words. Base online. Back at the garage, Ray answered from the bench radio. Storm's already here. Washington Bridge has got a stalled school bus. You want location? Walter already knew where he was headed. I'll get eyes first. Call Bobby. Tell him to prep backup gear and get the tow trailer ready. You sure? Ray's voice cracked slightly. It's rising fast out there. Walter didn't hesitate. That's why I built it. As he turned off 5th Street onto Riverside, the full scale of it began to unfold. Cars floated nose first into ditches, their headlights flickering like drowning stars. An SUV sat sideways across 2 front lawns, driver windows shattered by flood debris. In the distance, a child's plastic playhouse bobbed like a buoy against a mailbox. Elmwood wasn't flooding, it was sinking. The road to the bridge took him through some of the lowest parts of town, where the creek and storm drains used to do their best work. Now it was a full basin, sloshing upward. Walter kept his speed steady. 25, engine smooth, gauges stable. He leaned slightly forward, hands light on the wheel, but mind locked in. The water was up to the mid-hub now, still manageable. He heard voices on the emergency channel. Dispatch overwhelmed, calls stacking up. Responder vehicles stuck or rerouting. They weren't going to reach everyone, not in time. Then came the voice that made Walter's jaw tighten. We've got multiple units stalled near the Jefferson Underpass. Fire Unit Bravo 1 underwater, requesting any active unit nearby. He keyed the mic. Responding. ETA 5 minutes. The reply came back slow, like they weren't sure who he was. Unit calling in, please identify. Walter didn't waste time. Gibson, civilian vehicle, it's built for this, trust me. Silence, then. Copy that. Please proceed. Caution advised. 5 minutes later, Walter turned the corner onto the flooded underpass and saw what they'd meant. The fire truck was halfway submerged, its red lights eerily refracted beneath the waterline. 2 firefighters clung to the roof, one waving frantically, the other gripping an unconscious man by the collar, trying to keep his head above water. Walter didn't flinch. He pulled up to the edge of the descent, shifted to low gear, activated the stabilization system, and drove in. The truck didn't hesitate. Water rose over the wheels, then the fenders. It touched the doors. The engine growled but held. The exhaust hissed, clean and hot, expelling steam like a dragon's breath. Walter rolled forward, slow and deliberate, until he was alongside the roof of the fire truck. He popped the lock on the passenger side, swung open the rear access, and nodded. Get in. One at a time. The rescue took less than 2 minutes. The man was barely breathing, lips blue, soaked through. One firefighter climbed in first, helping haul the body into the back seat. The second followed, shaking, eyes wide. What the hell kind of truck is this? He asked. Walter didn't answer. He was already turning the wheel. Outside, the water kept rising. Inside the truck, everything still worked. And the flood was only just beginning. The first rescue changed everything. Not just for Walter, but for the town. Word spread faster than the water could rise. A fire crew pulled from a drowning truck by a civilian driving a truck that didn't stall, didn't flood, didn't even falter. That wasn't just rare, that was impossible. But impossible things don't need permission to exist. They just need someone stubborn enough to build them. As the word Gibson echoed through dispatch radios and across makeshift command posts, people began to understand. There was one vehicle in Elmwood that could go where nothing else could. Walter didn't stop. He didn't pause to celebrate or to process. He drove. From Jefferson to Maple, from the southern edge of town to the school district offices, where faculty had become prisoners inside a single-story building now neck-deep in floodwater. There were 14 people trapped inside, teachers, staff, and 2 custodians who'd stayed late thinking they could weather the storm. The front entrance had long since disappeared under the current. Power was out, doors swollen shut, water pressing through vents and crawl spaces. Walter eased the truck up onto the sloping lawn that now resembled a shallow bay, throwing the gear into park and tossing a line to the nearest second-story window. One of the teachers caught it, wide-eyed and shaking. and within minutes the first group was sliding down the roof and into the bed of the truck, covered in ponchos and blankets Walter had packed the day before. Nobody knew what to say. Most just stared at the vehicle around them, the modified pipes, the strange engine sounds, the sealed interior, and then at the man in the driver's seat, who looked neither surprised nor excited, just focused, driven. From there it became a rhythm. Drive in, pull out, deliver, return. He dropped the first group at Elmwood Middle, where a triage zone had been set up on the second floor, and he was gone again before the school nurse could thank him. People began tracking him like a shadow. Walter was last seen near Route 7. He's heading toward the Holloway farm. Check the grain silo. Gibson passed that way an hour ago. At one point, someone suggested painting the truck bright orange to make it easier to see. Walter shook his head. Doesn't need to be seen, he said. It needs to get through. By nightfall, the town's official rescue vehicles had all been pulled out of rotation. Too deep, too dangerous, too unpredictable. The water wasn't just collecting anymore, it was moving. Fast. Current lines were pulling cars sideways. Whole trees floated through intersections. Basements collapsed. Gas lines ruptured, and cell towers began to fail one by one. But Walter kept going. The modifications he'd spent months installing weren't theories anymore. They were reality. The sealed ignition held strong. The raised intake stayed dry. The water pressure sensors beeped in his ear only once, briefly, when he dipped too deep near the Washington Bridge, then silenced themselves again as he throttled up, steadied the wheel, and pushed through. That crossing would become a story on its own. The bridge was already cracking, asphalt peeling at the seams, water rushing over the surface like a broken dam. Most would have turned back, but Walter knew time was a predator, and the family waiting on the far side had a toddler with no medication, an elderly mother who couldn't walk, and no chance if he failed. He didn't even slow down. Tires half submerged, he drove straight across, bumper to bumper, engine howling low and angry, but never braking. He got the family out. Less than 5 minutes later, the bridge gave way, crumbling into the roaring flood like paper dipped in oil. That night, Walter rescued 21 people. He never counted, but others did. Deputy Williams, working from a satellite map and flood overlay with his sleeves rolled and his radio hissing with static, kept a quiet log. Gibson, 3 from Jefferson, 5 from the school, 2 from the Holloway farm, 4 from the church basement. The numbers added up, and each time someone asked how it was possible, all Jake could say was, "He built it different, built it for this." By midnight, the town wasn't just surviving, it was watching. Lights flickered from upstairs windows. Families huddled around second floors with blankets and lanterns, listening for the low rumble of Walter's engine. Some said they could feel it before they could hear it, like a heartbeat in the ground. Others said they just knew he would come, that if he'd heard about them, he wouldn't stop until he reached them. That night, Walter was more than a man in a truck. He was movement, proof that something still worked in a town falling apart. He became a signal, a myth in motion. At the edge of town, in a crumbling old house off Route 9, Agnes Murphy stood in thigh-deep water, clutching a wooden box filled with photographs, letters, and old recipes she hadn't opened in years. 92 years old, too proud to leave, too stubborn to ask for help. Walter found her by sheer instinct. He remembered the porch, the corner trim, the way Margaret used to stop there every Halloween to deliver cookies. The moment he saw the familiar shape of the roofline rising above the flood, he veered hard, splashing across what used to be a yard and is now a shallow lake of furniture, toys, and trash bins. Agnes looked up, blinking through the rain, and Walter was already pulling her box into the cab before she could even ask what he was doing. As he carried her down the steps on his back, tiny and weightless against him, she said only one thing: Margaret would be proud. He nodded, didn't speak, and the truck rolled on, one life at a time. By dawn, the town wasn't sleeping anymore. Elmwood had become a place without hours, where night and day blurred into a single state of survival. The power grid had failed sometime after 2 a.m., plunging the valley into a blackness broken only by battery lanterns, flashlights, and the occasional flicker of headlights moving slowly through floodwaters, and always, always the steady guttural growl of that one machine still pushing through, Walter's truck. It had made so many passes through the streets by then that the locals started calling it the flood truck. First just a nickname whispered between neighbors, then spoken into radios, shouted from windows, etched onto hastily written notes stuck to trees and fences. Flood truck passed here. Flood truck try church basement. Send flood truck to East Ridge. Back at the garage, now functioning more like a command center than a repair shop, Ray Martinez had taken over coordination. He stayed near the two-way, managing what Walter couldn't see, feeding him updates on trapped families, impassable roads, collapsed shelters. Ray had been skeptical at first, no question. He'd laughed at the snorkel pipes, joked about the doom truck, even tried to talk Walter out of sinking more money into what he thought was a dead end. But now, hunched over maps soaked with rainwater, talking to sheriff's deputies and field medics with the clipped efficiency of a battlefield operator, he was the backbone of an operation that no one had asked for, but everyone had come to rely on. Flood truck en route, he'd say into the mic. ETA 9 minutes, hold tight. Bobby, the kid who once couldn't tell a carburetor from a crankshaft, had grown 10 years older in just one night. He was coordinating incoming supply requests, breaking down salvageable parts, prepping rescue gear, refueling the truck when Walter came in for barely 2-minute pit stops. Every time the truck returned, soaked in river grime and the scent of diesel and lake rot, Bobby jumped into action like a NASCAR pit crew, sliding under the undercarriage to check seals, wiping down the intake vents, patching up dings in the waterproofing with sealant and grit. He never asked Walter how bad it was out there. He could read it on his face, mud streaked across one cheek, water dripping from the bill of his cap, a 1,000-yard stare interrupted only by quiet nods and terse updates. 3 pulled from a sedan on Beckett Road, 1 in shock, rest okay. And then, just like that, back out into the flood. The truck had become something bigger than a vehicle. It was a message, a presence. There was something about the way it moved, slow but sure, never faltering, always appearing when things were worst, that filled people with a strange, desperate kind of hope. Some said it made no sound at all until it was right outside your door. Others said they could hear it growling long before it arrived, like thunder in the bones. More than one person, soaking wet and trembling after being lifted into its warm, dry cabin, broke down crying, not just because they'd been saved, but because someone had come at all, because something had come, something real. The truck wasn't comfortable. It wasn't built for luxury. It didn't have soft seats or heat in the back, no padded headrests or TV screens. But it was warm, dry, safe. The doors closed with a reassuring hiss. The engine hummed like a living thing, and the moment you were inside, you knew you were going to make it. You knew, somehow, that it could carry you wherever you needed to go, that it wouldn't break down, that it had already stared the worst this storm could throw at it and kept moving forward. That was something no one else could offer. And still, Walter didn't rest. He ran on black coffee, instinct, and a rhythm of movement that no one dared interrupt. His route shifted constantly. He had no set plan, just coordinates fed to him through static-filled radio lines, handwritten notes left on barricades, sometimes just the word of a stranger shouting from a rooftop. He responded to cries for help the way a compass responds to magnetic north, automatically, without hesitation. He rescued a group of elderly residents from a submerged retirement home where no rescue crews had managed to reach. He ferried a diabetic man across town to the one pharmacy still above water. He pulled a woman and her newborn from the attic of a burning house, the water having shorted the electrical box and started a fire no one could put out. That run nearly cost him the truck. The flames licked the side panel, melted part of the fender. Bobby patched it with steel from an old mower blade. It wasn't pretty, but it held. There was one moment, just one, when Walter stopped. A short pause near the old feed store where he sat in the driver's seat watching the flood curl through the low lots like a serpent, swallowing everything in its path. It was quiet there, still. He could smell the rain on the metal, hear the occasional clatter of something breaking loose and drifting away. He looked down at his hands, cracked, bruised, shaking from exhaustion. His wedding ring caught the faint grey light. For a second, he reached across to the passenger seat where no one had sat in years and tapped the photo taped to the dash. Margaret, smiling, arms around a basket of fresh tomatoes, hair blown across her cheek. She had always worried about the creek. "One day it's gonna come for us," she'd said more than once. "Better to be ready." He didn't say a word, just nodded to the photo like she'd spoken out loud, then shifted the truck back into gear, and down the road he went into the deep where no one else could follow. It was 6:03 a.m. when the call came in, not through a radio or an emergency frequency, but through Walter's old Nokia, the one he kept turned off most days unless there was a part to order or a stubborn vendor who still refused to email. It rang only once, just once, and for some reason, despite the soaked gloves on his hands and the next rescue location blinking on the GPS, Walter picked it up. He wasn't in a position to talk. The truck was parked on a slanting ridge overlooking Oak Hollow, headlights cutting through a valley of water so deep it had swallowed the bottom floor of every house in sight. He had eyes on a family trapped on a rooftop. 2 adults, 3 children, 1 dog, no shelter. Ray's voice had just crackled through, telling him backup might be hours away, and still Walter answered the phone. The line was quiet for a moment, then came the voice. Soft, steady, unfamiliar at first, like a song he hadn't heard in years. "It's me," the voice said. "It's Sarah." The name dropped into his chest like a stone. For a moment, Walter forgot the storm, forgot the truck, forgot the water rising outside his window. Sarah, his daughter, the one who hadn't spoken to him in 15 years, the one who had left Elmwood for good with her diploma in one hand and a bitter silence in the other. She hadn't come back when Margaret died. She hadn't called when the house went quiet. Walter had told himself it was fine, told himself she was busy, told himself he'd raised her to be strong enough not to look back. But still, the silence had built up like rust on old metal, and now, out of nowhere, here she was, in his ear, in his truck, in his life again. "I saw it," she said before he could speak. "The videos, the reports, the truck, it's everywhere." Walter didn't answer. Not right away. He didn't know there were videos. He hadn't noticed anyone recording, hadn't thought to ask. He hadn't done any of it for attention, but apparently attention had found him anyway. He glanced at the dash, at the green lights still glowing, engine purring beneath him like a warhorse itching to run again. Below, the family on the rooftop waved frantically, their signals barely visible through the sheet of rain. He had a decision to make, but the voice in his ear held him for a second longer. "They're calling it a miracle," Sarah continued. "Some of the agencies I work with, they thought it was fake, like some movie set. But I told them, no, that's real, that's my father, that's what he does. He builds things that work when nothing else does." The floodlight illuminated the rooftop more clearly now. One of the children had started crying, arms wrapped tight around a soaked golden retriever. Walter tapped the throttle, inching forward to get a better angle, and finally spoke. His voice came out low, almost gruff. "Didn't build it for them. Built it 'cause it needed to be built." "I know," she said. "I know you didn't. That's why it matters." And then she paused, and her voice changed. It wasn't just personal anymore. It was official. "I work for the Department of Energy now. Emergency logistics and infrastructure resilience. We've never seen anything like your truck. I'm on the phone with people who don't blink at billion-dollar disasters, and they're all asking the same thing. How is this thing even real? Why haven't we seen it before?" Walter was already steering into the water. The flood licked the doors, brushed the wheel wells, surged around the tires with force. He pressed the comm button on the dash, signaling Ray he was moving in. The family on the rooftop turned as one toward the sound, their faces brightening in disbelief. The dog started barking, wagging its tail like salvation had a sound it remembered. Walter leaned forward as the truck powered through. "I need the specs, Dad," Sarah said. "I know you hate that word, but this isn't just an invention. It's a blueprint for survival. What you've done, it changes things. You could save lives, not just today, everywhere. Flood zones, war zones, hurricanes, and not with some billion-dollar prototype either. This is real, field-proven. You built it with your own hands, in a town nobody noticed, and it's doing what half the government can't." He didn't respond, not yet. He focused on angling the truck to the far side of the house, positioning it close enough for the father to climb down first, arms shaking but determined. Then the mother, holding the smallest child close, then the next two kids, one hesitating, then leaping into Walter's waiting arms, then the dog, the whole cabin filled with heat and movement and relief, and still, Sarah was on the line. "They want to talk to you, they want to see it, send people out, test it, model it, but none of that works unless you say yes, and I need to know, are you going to let this thing stay in Elmwood, or are you going to let it save more people than you ever imagined?" He watched the father secure his children with seatbelts, hands shaking as he wrapped them in blankets from Walter's kit. He looked at the mother, eyes full of tears, whispering something Walter didn't want to interrupt. Then he pressed the phone back to his ear. "I didn't build it to be famous," he said. "Didn't build it to make deals." "I know," Sarah said, "but maybe you built it for me. For this. For now." And that stopped him. Not the rain, not the road, just that. For a long moment neither of them said anything. Then, over the comm, Ray's voice cut in. "Walter, got another one. Nursing home east side, still occupied. Floods climbing fast." Walter looked at the children in the rear view, at the dog, curled and quiet, at the water outside, thick with debris, current pulling harder now. "Put them on the list," he said, voice steady. "I'm headed there next." The phone was still in his hand. He raised it to his ear once more. "You want the specs," he said. "Fine, but not for sale, not for show. You tell them this. It only goes to the ones who'll use it to save people. You get me?" "I do," Sarah said. "I promise." And for the first time in 15 years, Walter didn't feel the distance, not between them, not anymore. He ended the call without a goodbye, just drove forward, toward the next rescue, toward the next life, and far beyond anything he'd ever imagined for himself. The rain finally began to ease sometime after noon on the second day. Not stop, just ease. It didn't fall in fists anymore, but in long, exhausted streaks, as if the storm itself had burned through its rage and was now just bleeding out the last of its strength. Elmwood, or what was left of it, looked like a battlefield. Not the kind with tanks and fire, but the quiet kind, where everything sits broken and still in the aftermath. Trees lay uprooted like felled giants across roads that no longer existed. Entire homes had shifted off foundations and now rested crooked in backyards that didn't belong to them. Mud coated everything, cars, doors, signs, sidewalks, making the whole town the same dull brown. The flood had begun to recede, yes, but slowly, almost reluctantly, dragging pieces of normal life with it as it went. And in the center of it all, parked in front of Walt's auto clinic, was the truck. Still stained with mud, still rumbling low and steady like it wasn't done yet. Around it people gathered, not just those Walter had saved, but others who'd heard the stories, seen the footage, or simply followed the sound of hope. They didn't cheer. It wasn't that kind of crowd. They stood with quiet awe, heads shaking slightly, mouths open like they were still trying to understand what they'd witnessed. Children pointed at the intake pipes. Adults murmured about the weird wiring and the snorkels, and the way the thing had floated, no, not floated, glided, through water that swallowed ambulances and cruisers. Some reached out and touched the body of the truck gently, like it might vanish if they looked away too long. Walter didn't notice them at first. He was leaning against the front bumper, jaw clenched, eyes red-rimmed from exhaustion and exposure. His hands, still trembling slightly, were bandaged from where he'd scraped them open, pulling debris from the undercarriage during the last run. He hadn't slept, barely eaten, but he stood straight, always straight. He looked at the truck, not the crowd. The truck was the only thing he trusted to be honest in all this. The only thing that didn't care about attention or praise or what came next. It just worked. It had worked. Then they arrived. 7 black limousines creeping down Main Street like a funeral procession. No sirens, no markings, just tinted glass and quiet menace. They came slowly, cautiously, like intruders approaching a sacred site. When they stopped, The doors opened in near unison, and out stepped the kinds of people Elmwood wasn't used to seeing. Men and women in suits worth more than most homes in the area. Earpieces coiled behind their ears, phones already out, faces carved from marble. Government, industry, private security, agencies with long names and longer intentions. At the front of the procession was a tall man with close-cropped grey hair and a slim briefcase, flanked by two aides who looked like they hadn't slept in a week. And beside him, stepping out last, was Sarah. She looked different. Not older, sharper, like someone who had lived fast and hard but never lost her sense of direction. Her eyes scanned the crowd, skipped past the murmurs, and locked instantly onto Walter. And in that single second, something passed between them, something wordless and solid and final. Not forgiveness, not apology, just recognition. Two paths converging. The grey-haired man stepped forward first, offering a hand Walter didn't take. He smiled tightly and began to speak, words practiced and polished. "Mr. Gibson, I'm Robert Kessler, Department of Infrastructure and Disaster Resilience. On behalf of the Federal Response Council and a coalition of global engineering partners, I want to commend you on what you've done here. Your truck has been the center of over 60 million online impressions in the last 24 hours. We've received requests from 13 different emergency departments across the country asking about the technology. Frankly, we've never seen anything quite like it." Walter didn't move, didn't blink, just said, "That's because you never needed to." Kessler hesitated, then continued, "We'd like to talk about licensing, about scaling, about retrofitting existing fleets with your design. There's funding available, grants, contracts, even private sector backing. You'd be compensated handsomely, of course, and your name would be everywhere." Walter glanced toward the truck, then toward Sarah, then back at Kessler. "I didn't build it for your fleets," he said quietly. "Didn't build it for your agencies either." Kessler's smile didn't falter, but something behind his eyes cooled. "Then who did you build it for, Mr. Gibson?" Walter looked out at the crowd, the soaked residents of Elmwood, the people he'd pulled from roofs and bridges and rooftops and fear, the people who'd once laughed at him and now stood silently, reverently. He raised one hand and gestured toward them. For them, silence. Sarah stepped forward then, gently placing herself between Walter and Kessler, speaking not like a daughter but like someone who understood both languages, the bureaucratic and the human. "Dad," she said, her voice low but firm, "you don't have to sell it, but you can still give it to the people who need it, on your terms, the specs, the system. We control the rollout. We make sure it doesn't get turned into some overpriced toy for cities that already have everything. You decide who gets it, not them." Walter looked at her, the sharpness in her voice, the fire. He saw Margaret in her then for the first time in years. After a long pause, he spoke again, voice rough but certain. "Then we do it clean. We make it simple, basic enough so it can be built in any shop anywhere. No patents, no nonsense. We teach them how to make it themselves. We don't save them. We give them the tools so they can save themselves." Sarah smiled. Kessler frowned, and the crowd began to stir, not in anger or noise, but in understanding, in awe, that this somehow was just the beginning. Walter turned back toward the truck, placed one hand on the hood, and nodded slightly, like a soldier saluting a comrade. It had done what it needed to do. Now it would do more. And behind him, the world began to listen. They stood together in the garage like time had been rewound. Same walls, same tools, same stubborn scent of oil and earth and old rags that never quite came clean. But everything was different. The storm outside had passed, but a quieter one lingered inside. Something unsaid, stretched tight across the distance between them. Walter leaned against the tool chest, arms crossed, face unreadable. Sarah walked the perimeter slowly, running her fingers along the workbench, tracing dust and grease with unfamiliar fingers, eyes flicking across the details of a world she'd once known, once hated, once run from. The pegboard was still lined with hand-labeled hooks, each tool exactly where it belonged. The old calendar on the wall still read March, the last month before the flood. Above the doorframe hung a faded photo of Margaret holding a socket wrench, and smiling like she belonged in a magazine no one would ever publish. Sarah stopped beneath it. She tilted her head slightly, expression softening as she looked up at the mother she'd lost too soon. "She never wanted me to leave," she said, more to the room than to her father. Walter didn't move. "Didn't stop you!" "I thought I had to," Sarah replied. "I thought I had to get as far away from here as possible if I wanted to do something that mattered." "You did," he said. "You did something big. But not like this," she said, finally turning to face him. "You did something that actually saved people. I just pushed papers, argued budgets, fought red tape while people died waiting for help that never came. You didn't wait. You just built the damn thing." Walter looked at her then, really looked. There was pride there, somewhere beneath the quiet weight of his eyes, but also pain, memory, things unspoken. "Didn't know if it'd work," he said. "Not at first. But you built it anyway." "Had to?" The silence between them was heavy but not cold. It was the kind of silence made of years, of missed birthdays and unreturned calls, of stubbornness passed from father to daughter like an unwanted heirloom, of grief held too long and words that never arrived on time. And now, standing in the aftermath of a disaster that had somehow become their bridge back to each other, they both saw it for what it was. Not a chasm, not any more, just distance, crossable. "I watched every second of it," Sarah said quietly. "The live streams, the footage, even the shaky phone videos people took from rooftops. You should have seen how they talked about you online. The flood driver, the man who outran water. There are hundreds of stories. Some are probably exaggerated, but the truth is stronger than all of them. You didn't need training or orders. You just moved." Walter shifted slightly, picking up a worn-out pair of gloves and squeezing them absently in his hands. "Wasn't about hero stuff," he muttered. "Was just tired of waiting for someone else to fix what keeps breaking." Sarah stepped closer. "Then let's fix more. Not just the truck, not just the town, all of it." He looked at her then, tired eyes under a brow heavy with weight, but no longer alone. "You really think they'll let us do it right?" "Not if we wait for permission," she said, "but if we build it the way you built this truck, simple, rugged, real, they won't have a choice, because people will see it works, and they'll build their own, in garages, in basements, in salvage yards and school workshops. Not one hero with one truck, thousands of trucks, thousands of towns ready to save themselves next time." Walter didn't smile, but he nodded, and for him that was more than enough. They worked through the morning, clearing space, gathering notes, reviewing what could be documented. Ray dropped by with a box of handwritten schematics Walter had drawn over the past year, organized by system. Engine mods, intake, exhaust, electrical insulation, pressure seals, ballast weighting. Sarah took photos, translated the notes into drafts that engineers could understand, stripped away jargon without stripping the soul. Bobby showed up just before noon with sandwiches and questions, asking how they could prototype a second version with off-the-shelf parts and cheaper materials. Walter didn't answer him. He just pointed to a dusty generator in the back corner and said, "Start there. It's got the right housing. Just needs a new spine." They weren't just patching a truck anymore. They were building a movement, designing something anyone could replicate with tools, grit, and maybe a little faith. No corporations, no million-dollar price tags, just resilience. In every corner of the country, they knew there were towns like Elmwood, places dismissed as small, places where help was always late or never came at all, places where a storm like this didn't make headlines unless it broke records. But those towns still mattered, and Walter's truck had shown what could happen when someone decided they weren't waiting anymore. Later, when the media crews started arriving and the limousines returned with bigger offers and better suits, it was Sarah who met them at the door. She didn't turn them away. She invited them in, but only on their terms. No exclusivity, no privatization. They could film, they could ask questions, but the plans were going public. Every page, every line. They'd launch it through a new foundation, one Sarah would manage, but Walter would guide, the Gibson Foundation, and its only mission would be this: give communities the means to prepare, not react, to build their own answers before the water came. Inside the garage, Walter placed the original key, bent, dented, nearly broken, into a glass case above the bench. Not for show, for memory, the start of it all. Then he walked out back to where Bobby had already started laying out parts for the second build. Sarah followed, clipboard in hand, hair tied back like she used to when she was 12 and helping him change oil in the driveway. They worked side by side in silence for a while, the way people do when words aren't necessary anymore. And when the sky turned orange and soft behind the broken horizon of Elmwood, Walter finally broke the quiet. "Still don't like government people," he said. Sarah smiled. "That's fine, I speak both languages now." He grunted. "Well, just make sure they know. If they mess this up, I'll build something louder next time." And for the first time in too many years, they laughed together. A deep, exhausted, honest kind of laugh. And in that small, sacred moment, the distance between them was gone. It started with one truck, that was all. One truck, built by a stubborn mechanic in a forgotten garage, welded together with memory and grief and grit, tested not in wind tunnels or simulations, but in the brutal, indifferent chaos of a flood. But by the end of the year there were hundreds, and then thousands. Some were nearly identical to Walter's original build. Same snorkel-mounted intake, same baffled exhaust, same water-sealed ignition system. Others had been modified, adapted, reinvented by local builders who had seen the footage, downloaded the open-source plans, and realized they didn't need permission to protect their own towns. They just needed tools and someone to show them where to start. The Gibson Foundation didn't look like a foundation. It didn't wear suits or host galas or care about boardrooms. It lived in shipping containers and community centers, in garages and backyards and reclaimed lots on the edges of cities that didn't have disaster budgets or helicopters. Sarah ran the logistics with the kind of discipline she'd once used to navigate federal bureaucracy, except now she was building something that moved, really moved. Not just reports and initiatives, but actual machines. She traveled constantly. One day she was in a town in Louisiana teaching local teens how to apply hydrophobic sealants to electrical systems. The next, she was in Bangladesh watching a group of women in headscarves construct their first flood-ready chassis out of salvaged tractor parts and recycled engine blocks. Everywhere she went, she carried her father's drawings, worn, grease-stained, not pretty but precise, and she carried his voice with her too. Every time someone asked what made the design so special, she'd say the same thing. It was never about horsepower. It was about staying alive when nothing else can. Walter, for his part, stayed in Elmwood. That was where he belonged, where he could work without being asked to explain himself. He didn't like speeches. He didn't go to conferences. He didn't even have a computer. But he built. Constantly, version after version. He'd try out new air filtration systems, test different ballast weights, adjust fuel mixes for regions that couldn't get diesel. Sometimes things exploded, sometimes they rusted, sometimes they just failed. And when they did, he took them apart and started again. Every few weeks, someone from the foundation would arrive at his garage with a van, pick up the latest prototype, and drive it off to a testing site. He never asked where. He trusted Sarah to make those calls. Their bond, once broken, had become something steel-strong and elemental. He built. She moved the pieces. Elmwood changed too. The flood had left scars, but it had also exposed something beneath the surface, something resilient, something stubbornly beautiful. The town rebuilt not just its homes, but its identity. The garage became a landmark. Tour buses started stopping there, though Walter refused to speak to any of them. Kids would press their faces to the dusty windows, hoping to catch a glimpse of the legendary truck. Sometimes he let them see it. Not always, but sometimes. And when he did, he'd point to the places where the truck had bent, cracked, nearly given out. "That's the truth," he'd say. "Not what it is, what it survived." At the edge of town, they built a small learning center with money from donations that poured in from every continent. Inside were workstations with tools, simulators, salvaged engines, welding stations. Bobby ran the place now, barely 20, teaching kids not just how to repair cars, but how to think like Walter. How to design for failure, not just function. how to see water not as the enemy, but as a force you had to outsmart. The media came and went. There were documentaries, books. Some flashy Hollywood executive tried to buy Walter's life story, promising a streaming series and creative control. He declined by sending back the contract with a note written in Sharpie, "Try building something useful instead." The story still spread, but it spread the right way, through people, through hands, through sweat and tools and shared blueprints printed in black and white on recycled paper in towns from Mozambique to Montana. Flood-prone communities that once relied on slow, underfunded government responses now had something they could build themselves. Quiet revolutions began in garages lit by a single bulb, and the truck, the original one, never moved again. Not because it couldn't, but because it had done its job. Walter kept it parked in the garage, cleaned it by hand every week, changed the oil even though it didn't run. When people asked him why, he said, "It's not mine anymore, it belongs to the story." One day, about a year after the flood, Walter sat outside the garage watching a group of kids from the learning center rebuild a battered van into a new kind of emergency unit. It had a roof hatch, extended ballast, a low center of gravity, flawed, yes, but ambitious. One of the kids, a wiry teenager with duct tape wrapped around his boots, looked up and asked, "Mr. Gibson, how do you know when it's good enough?" Walter took a long sip from his thermos, eyes on the van. "You don't," he said. "You just make sure it's better than yesterday." That was the legacy. Not perfection, not praise, just progress. Quiet, relentless, real. So it started with one truck, but it ended with a world that no longer waited to be rescued, a world that had learned at last how to build its own way out.